Hi, I'm Scott Mansell and welcome to Drive 61's University Series. In today's tutorial we're taking a look at how to fully use your vision, feel and hearing, the three senses that you use when driving on circuit. So when we're driving at the limit on circuit, there's three senses that we'll use. Vision, firstly taking in all of that information from the tracks such as braking references, when you're looking towards the apex, when you're looking towards the exit, a change in asphalt on the circuit, all of these different things. The second one is feel, whether you can feel some oversteer in the car, how you feel the car is on the brakes, and so on. And finally, the third sense is hearing. It's hearing when the tyres are screeching, when the engine is almost at maximum RPM so you can make a gear change. And when you're out on the circuit trying to drive at the limit, you're really using a blend of all of these three senses to get the most information that you can from the car and from the circuit. So why do we need to absorb and process as much information from the circuit as possible? Well, basically, the more information that we take from the car and from the circuit using our senses, the better decisions that we're going to make. The more information that we can process, the more we're going to understand exactly how the car's reacting and our position on the circuit. And to really drive at the limit consistently and to really get the most out of the car, we need to be fully utilizing all of these senses at every point on the circuit. So when I talk about processing all this information, we're not consciously thinking, oh look, there's the braking point, oh now the car's oversteering and we need to correct it. We're actually doing all of this subconsciously. So the idea with this tutorial is to explain to you how we can actually receive more information from the circuit and process that information and eventually do this subconsciously so that we open up some capacity and we don't actually need to think about it when we're driving on the circuit. If you improve any of these three senses and process that information a little bit better, you will go faster. It's just worth saying at the moment that you can't just force speed when you're driving on the circuit. If you try to go faster, if you consciously try and push harder, maybe you'll go slightly quicker for a couple of laps, but you'll just plateau at this level. What you actually need to do is to take your time a little bit more, open up a little bit of mental capacity and do these things subconsciously so that you don't have to think about them when you're driving on track. For example, if you turn into the corner and you get a little bit of oversteer, we don't actually need to consciously be thinking that we need to put some opposite lock into the car. All of these things need to become natural. And in today's tutorial, we're going to show you how to open up your senses, receive a bit more information, and really get your lap time down a little bit when you're driving on circuit. So aside from being able to drive at the limit better when you're increasing your capacity with your senses, we can also make fewer mistakes. Now, all drivers make mistakes. I myself am making mistakes all the time when I'm driving on the circuit. Now, I'm not talking about missing an apex by 10 meters. I'm talking about carrying half a mile an hour too quick into an apex and then adjusting myself how I come off the brakes and how I turn into the corner so that it has the smallest effect on my lap time. Now, a good driver will make small mistakes, but because he's utilizing his senses as much as possible and processing that information really well, he'll instantly understand that we are carrying that bit too much speed into the corner or we've turned in that little bit too early. He'll realize this and then he'll make changes accordingly to minimize the mistake. So when you process all of this information a little bit better, you'll actually make smaller and smaller mistakes so that almost they're not actually mistakes. You might turn in a little bit too late, but that means that you'll actually improve your exit and so on. So just to demonstrate that fact, we have a little diagram here. Now there's three racing lines going around this right-hand hairpin here. The blue line is the ideal line, and the green and orange lines are where drivers have made mistakes, where they've carried a little bit too much speed into the corner, probably because they've braked a little bit too late. But the green line is a good driver who's realized his mistake quite early on and adjusted his line, adjusted his braking accordingly. And the orange line is a driver who has been unaware that he's carried too much speed into the corner. And you'll see later that he continues that mistake around the corner. So the blue line here, you can see we get on the brakes as normal, release the brakes as we're turning into the corner, quite a late apex in this hairpin so that we can maximize the exit, get a good exit coming out the corner. Very traditional line here. The green line is a driver who's braked a little bit too late, run a little bit deep into the corner. But as you can see here, he runs deep into the corner. He'll have a lower minimum speed here than the ideal racing line. But what he'll do here is adjust his technique slightly, get the car turned a little bit earlier in the corner here, and straight line the exit. So yes, he may have lost a bit of time on the entry, but he'll make almost all of that time up probably on the exit, because we've got the car turned a little bit earlier, we straight line the exit and we can get on the throttle that bit sooner. So we're minimizing the effect of the mistake when we've got on the brakes that little bit too late. On the other hand, look at the orange line. The orange driver has got on the brakes in the same place as the green driver. They've both braked that little bit too late. But as we're coming into the corner here, the orange driver doesn't really realize that he's carried too much speed in, and he tries to turn the car in the same place. At this point, the car will probably understeer or oversteer slightly. Anyway, he's going to miss the apex. So as we're coming into the mid-corner here, we're nowhere near the apex. The driver is just beginning to realize now, because he's processing that information a little bit slower. But by this time, it's way too late. And as we're coming out the corner, we're still turning as we're coming up to the exit curb, which means that he can't get on the accelerator anywhere near as soon as the blue or the green drivers. This means that the orange driver has lost time on the brakes going into the corner, but also carried that deficit and multiplied it, in fact, as we're coming out of the corner. So next up, we're going to take a look at why these three senses are important. So the first one is vision. Now, many of the inputs that you make into the car come from your vision. You'll be looking towards the apex. You'll be looking for braking references. All this information is coming from your vision. So it's very important that you process this information as quickly as possible and as much of it as possible so that we can be quick on track. Now, if you haven't already, please watch the vision tutorial, which will be linked below, that we did earlier in the series, which explains exactly where you should be looking at each point in the corner. Vision's a critical technique to get right before you start driving properly on circuit. Now, as I mentioned, there's a big difference between what you see and how much of that information you process. And a little later in this tutorial, we're going to go over that, how you can try and process more of this information when you're driving. Now, you may have noticed, if you've watched any form of racing, that there are some drivers who always seem to get into the accidents at the start of a Grand Prix or at the start of any other race. Now, it's not that they're seeing any less than the good drivers, it's just that they're not processing this information as well as some of the other drivers. Good drivers will feel that there's another car alongside them or something like this, and they haven't got a sixth sense. It's just the fact that they may have seen the car flash by in the mirrors and then caught the car in their peripheral vision, for example. It's not that they've got this special sense, it's just that they're processing this visual information better than other drivers. The next most important sense is feel. Now, feel is very important because it tells you how the car is reacting to your inputs. You'll feel it through your backside, you'll feel it through the steering wheel, and to some extent you'll feel it through the pedals. It's critical to know that when you turn the steering wheel, that you're just getting a little bit of oversteer, a little bit of understeer, how the car is rolling, for example, and all of these things make it easier and easier to drive the car at the limit at all times. You'll also feel understeer and oversteer through the steering wheel. Now, you won't feel it as early as you will through your backside because it happens as the understeer or the oversteer is happening, but you will feel it through the steering wheel, and it acts almost as confirmation that the car is sliding in this way. The other reason that feel is important is because you'll feel bumps in the circuit and curbs on the track. So this is important because it actually helps to understand exactly where you are on the circuit in terms of coming into the apex or braking points, for example. For example, at Spa, I can't tell you exactly how many meters away from the corner I brake at the bus stop, but I can tell you it's about 20 meters after the bump in the braking zone. So all these little cues that you get from feel on the circuit really help you to understand the position of the car when you're driving on the racing line. Now, the final important sense, or the final sense that we use when we're driving on track, is hearing. Now, hearing is something that we probably don't think that we use too much on the circuit, but we do use it a surprising amount. For example, when we're shifting up the gears, we know the tone of the engine as it's coming to the top of the rev range, so we make an upshift. You can also use your hearing to confirm when there's a loss of traction from the driven wheels. When we have some wheel spin, you'll hear the engine revs come up. You can also hear a locked tyre or a sliding tyre in some cars. Obviously, if the engine noise is too much, you won't hear this, but in lots of racing cars, you can hear when you lock a tyre. And obviously, when you're racing, you can hear other cars around you. So if you're about to be overtaken, you can hear that another car is about to come past. So how do we go about improving how we process all of this information that we get from our senses? Well, the first thing that I do with my drivers is I run them through a little eye exercise that improves the connection between your eyes and your brain and how quickly you can process that information. Now, this exercise only takes 1 or 2 minutes each time you do it. I recommend that you do it once a day, and especially before you jump in the car when you go out to drive in a session. So all you need to do is keep your head straight, put your arm out in front of you, and follow your thumb around in a figure of 8. So when you first do this, you may notice that your eyes are jumping from position to position. The more that you do it, the smoother that your vision will get. And this actually helps you to absorb more information when you're driving on the circuit. So try and do this for a couple of weeks before your next driving session, and then do it before you jump in the car. And really the feedback that we get is that drivers actually feel like they're absorbing more information and seeing more things when they're driving on the circuit. The next thing that I get my drivers to do is to consciously think about each sense individually when they're driving on the circuit. So if you have some free sessions, take 3 of them away, maybe only 10 minutes or so per session, and try to think about each sense individually in each session. Now, I recommend that you only drive at 60 to 80% of your normal speed. The reason being that if you try to go flat out and you're trying to especially think about one sense in particular, you'll go over capacity and make a silly little mistake. So open up some capacity by driving a little bit slower, and then consciously think about each sense individually. Now, when you go out into your first session, try to think consciously about your vision and all the things out on the circuit. So you want to be looking for the curbs, for rubber marks as you come into the apex, patches of grass where you might be braking near or apexing near, changes in the asphalt, for example, how the white lines are, if there's a gap in the white line, and you can use this for apex or a braking reference, any bridges or gantries that might come over the circuit, and any dirt patches that there are on the track, especially on the interior curves. And just when you're driving around, try and consciously notice all of these different things. Now, try not to move your focus away from where it should be, that extra couple of seconds ahead of where you are on the circuit, but try and absorb a bit more information from your peripheral vision and what's around you. In the second session, you should focus on what you're feeling through the car, what you're feeling through the steering wheel, whether the car's oversteering or understeering, any bumps you feel in the circuit, especially in the braking zones or coming into the apex, how the curbs feel, how much the car jumps over the curbs, or whether the curbs are flat and maybe you can take a bit more, how the car is rolling when you turn it, how the car is diving at the front when you get on the brakes, and how the car is squatting when you get on the accelerator, and how much brake pressure you're putting through the pedal. Now, there's many things that you can obviously think about when you're trying to feel the car, but the main thing is just to be aware and give much more attention to this specific sense when you're driving in this second session. In the third session, it's time to think about your hearing. So think about the engine tone, think about where the rev limiter is, and think about when you should be changing gear. Try and hear, if you can hear the tyres locking when you get on the brakes too hard. If you can hear the tyres screeching when you get a little bit of understeer. Try and understand what the curbs feel like, what the curbs sound like when you run over them. It's all these little pieces of information that will give you a much broader base of information when you're driving. And then also think about the other cars around you, whether you can hear when a car's overtaking you or when you're alongside another car. So when you do this and you focus on each sense individually, you'll probably notice that you're actually noticing more about each individual sense than you would do normally. The next time that you go out in the car, hopefully some of these things will have sunk in and you'll have opened up each sense and you'll be able to process a little bit more information. Now, it isn't something that just happens in the first 3 sessions. You're going to have to do it every now and then when you go on your track day to really get the most from it. The next thing that you should do when you've actually done these 3 sessions is sit down in the back of the truck or wherever you can and actually debrief yourself. Think about these three individual senses and visualize each corner. So make a few columns, go through each corner and write down exactly what you saw in each corner, exactly what you felt in each corner, and exactly what you heard in each corner. And this process of almost downloading the information from your brain will open yourself up the next time you go on circuit. So hopefully you'll be able to process all of this information a bit quicker and then be able to drive at the limit of the car and the circuit much more consistently. So that's all for today's tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. These tutorials will always be free, so if you enjoyed it, please share it with your social media so we can get this information to as many people as possible. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.